Robert, this is the place for history on KY3's digital side, and we're very pleased to have you here. Robert Gangwer. He is an author, and he has produced a book on really another just incredible American who served our country and has just an incredible story to tell. And the woman's name is Blanche Barnes. And she's a Missourian, so she started her life in Kansas City. Can you tell me about her early life in KC?
Yeah, she was born and raised in the old Northeast area of Kansas City, Missouri. Um, Pretty typical life for the 1920s and 30s. Nothing particularly unique. Her church was really the center of her social as well as religious life. And about the only thing that really made her unique, perhaps among her peers, was her love of music and her talent for music. She learned to play the piano um, at the age of 6 and later learned how to play a pipe organ. And the other thing that set her apart probably was her education. Most women in the 1930s and 40s did not go to college. But she not only went to Northwestern University, but she ended up getting 2 bachelor's degree and a master's degree and studied as a concert pianist. So that was probably the things that set her apart from her peers.
And then at some point she meets a man, falls in love in Kansas City, and she marries this man. Can you tell me about that romance?
Yeah, they met in the choir at church. Like I said, her whole social life was centered around their church. And he was 3 or 4 years older than her, but they ended up falling in love. And as you indicate, they got married right after Pearl Harbor, probably about 5 months after Pearl Harbor in April of 1942. And he was already in the military. He was in the Army Air Corps. And you might ask, well, why in the world would they get married when they knew he was headed overseas and was in for the duration? But as my mother always said, she knew that was the only man she wanted to marry, so she thought, why not do it now? And so they got married, and she followed him down to Florida, where he was still participating in training. He was part of a B-24 crew.
And he goes through this training and goes off to war. And this is the part where Blanche's story could go one of many directions. So before we go into where her life goes, what happens to him in their marriage?
Well, he left Florida to head overseas. He was going to head to the European Theater of Operations. And back then, we're talking about in early 1942, you might ask yourself, well, the easiest way to get to Europe in a plane was to just fly the North Atlantic. But depending on weather, that could be very dangerous. So instead, they'd fly down to Africa, or excuse me, Africa, South America, and then over to Africa, and then up toward Egypt, and ultimately into the Mediterranean. And he left. Again, they'd only been married for 3 months and didn't even make it to Egypt. His plane, not sure exactly what happened, but he either hit a thunderstorm, hit by lightning, but the plane literally broke up midair and crashed, and everybody on board was killed. And again, this was only 3 months after they were married.
So how does she react to this great tragedy that too many people felt in that time period of World War II? They lost a loved one.
Well, it would have been more, um, uh, I guess, from her perspective, much better if she had known immediately. But unfortunately, he was listed as missing in action. And although it seemed like at the time that more than likely he was dead, it took a long time for them to get to the crash site and to identify the remains, etc. So she literally went for another 3 months and was not sure that he was actually dead. And you
Mm.
can imagine what she went through. The worst part is not knowing. But once it was clear that he wasn't coming back, she literally didn't know what to do. She took almost a year to grieve and to try to get her bearings. She felt guilty actually for surviving. He was the one that was going off to war, and she couldn't understand why she was still there and he wasn't, and wasn't sure what to do with her life because, like I said, she had no interest in any other men. And she finally came to the conclusion after going back to school for a while that she just wanted to do something for the war effort. And that was not unusual during the World War II era. Almost everybody wanted to do something for the war effort, whether overseas or at home. And she finally decided that she wanted to do something not only to help the war effort, but to help the GIs directly. And that meant she wanted to go overseas. And there are only a couple of opportunities for women to do so at that time.
So this begins her transformation. She, if you don't mind me putting this in my words,
No, go ahead.
she takes her grief over this loss and the guilt and transforms it into action. And how does that action show up
Well,
on the world stage, if you will?
yeah, I mean, it's when she was going through this process, she decides that she wanted to join the WASP, which is, the women's air corps. That was I guess, similar to the men's air corps. But what the women did, the pilots, the female pilots, they flew transports. They transported planes from one place to the next, basically doing all those kinds of things that men would have to do, but they free up the men for actual combat. And she decides that's what she wants to do. And you might think, well, that's a little odd since her husband died in an airplane. And for the first year or so, she was scared of airplanes. And every time she heard an airplane, she thought of her dead husband, and finally decided that the only way she was going to get over that was to actually learn how to fly. So she went and took flight lessons, got her pilot's license, only to find out later that to join the WASP, you had to be at least 5'4" or taller, and she was only 5 foot, so she was very petite. And so that she couldn't do. And finally, just going to a movie theater and seeing a little ad for the American Red Cross, she learned about the fact that the Red Cross were sending women overseas to actually work in hospitals, work on clubmobiles, work at naval bases, et cetera. And she thought that's the way she was going to get into the war and actually go and directly help GIs and sailors and aviators.
So she makes it over to England, I understand. And what does she see and how does she feel about her contributions as she makes it to England?
Yeah, she ends up getting trained in Washington, D.C., takes the Queen Elizabeth across the Atlantic, lands in Scotland, takes a train down to London, which the train actually goes through a buzz bomb attack, which I don't know if your viewers know what a buzz bomb is, but it's one of Hitler's vengeance weapons. And it's one of the first rockets that was ever developed. And they're not very accurate, but boy, they can cause a lot of damage. And when she entered London, or the train that she was on, they actually were going through a buzz bomb attack. And the first couple of days, she was actually in the Red Cross dorm. They went through several buzz bomb attacks and spent her first night in London under her bed, actually. And ultimately was assigned to the Clubmobile program, which was very unique, again, for the time, and something that turned out to be incredibly popular with the GIs.
So tell me about that program. A lot of people may not know the particulars of it, or they may know something about donuts, or just very little about it.
Yeah. Well, it was the brainchild of Harvey Gibson, who was the commissioner for the Red Cross over in London at the time. And he was painfully aware of the fact that all of the brick and mortar Red Cross facilities were all in the major cities. And the only time the aviators, the GIs, the sailors could actually visit a Red Cross facility was when they were on leave. And so he decided that it would be much more practical to take the Red Cross services to where the men were stationed. And the way to do that, he came up with an idea of taking a bus, converting it to kind of a mobile kitchen, if you will, putting a donut machine in the back and some 50-gallon coffee urns, putting a bunch of magazines and 78 records, et cetera, in the back, staffing, and this was the really brilliant part, staffing it with American women. And those 3 women then would drive to a naval base, air base, whatever, and serve coffee and donuts. And what my mother did was she lived or was stationed outside of Kettering, which is in the central, north central part of England. And they were assigned to about 5 different air bases. And every morning they'd go to a different air base. They'd serve coffee and donuts to the men as they were getting ready to leave on their missions. And then they'd wait until the men came back and do it again. And of course, she got to know many of the men in the process, and of course, went through the pain of seeing a lot of crews not come back. And so, but the men loved it. They loved it because the fact that they couldn't believe American women would actually agree to go all the way overseas and do that just for their morale. And it was very successful.
There are a couple things in your answer there I want to go back over. So you are not only an author of this book, you had a really good primary source, it sounds like, when you say your mother.
Yes. Yes, I'm sorry. I don't know that I hadn't mentioned that, but this book is about my mother and her service during World War II. And I was a lawyer by profession, but when I retired, I wanted to write history because history's always been my first love. I had a master's and a bachelor's degree in history. But when you're trying to make a living and put a roof over your head, you don't get to do those things. But when I retired, that was my goal. And in thinking about what do I want to write about? Well, for 40 years, I had been interviewing my parents about family history. And I had heard their stories, and my father was in World War II also. But his experience was no different than a million of other men during the World War II era. He was in Patton's Third Army, et cetera. Very interesting, but not necessarily unique. But my mother's story was quite unique because we're only talking about, if you're just looking at the Clubmobile part of the program, only about 850 women served in Clubmobiles in the European Theater of Operations during World War II. So it's a small sample size. And that's why I decided to write a book about her. And you're right, for 40 years, every time we went out to dinner, every time I visited them at their house, I took the opportunity to ask more questions. And then that night when I went home, I wrote them down.
That is just incredible to have a source like that, because a lot of times when you're, as a journalist, you're researching or you're writing a story, or I imagine for an author, really getting those good sources and having good source material is the biggest challenge. And you have that right there at your fingertips. So you're talking about going to dinners and you're hearing stories, and I understand you heard stories about some of the notable people she met through her work, which she didn't have to do. So many women contributed to World War II, and they didn't have to do this. This is above and beyond.
Yeah, and I was very lucky for 2 reasons. One, she lived to be 101, so she was around a long time, even well into my adulthood. Number 2, she had a great memory. Because as an historian, writing down her memories and her stories is certainly a starting point. but I worked for years trying to verify uh, where she was. If she said that certain people were there at the same time, I tried to verify that those people were actually in those locations at that time. And and she just had an incredible memory. I was always blown away by the fact that almost everything always was easy to verify. And the experiences that you're talking about were things that just captured my interest, like the fact that she had dinner with General Omar Bradley, another great Missourian. She went swimming, literally, with the Glenn Miller Band. She took a cruise down the Rhine on Hitler's yacht. She heard General Patton give a speech and was shocked by his his descriptions of killing the enemy and all of his cussing. For women of the 1940s, that was kind of shocking. Um, she, as I already indicated, she had a pilot's license. And one time when she got leave, she went from Germany back to England to visit friends. And on the way back, the men there at Molesworth, one of the air fields that she serviced when she was in England, said that she could hitch a ride on a B-17. And she loved the B-17. She thought they were beautiful planes. And so during the time that they, right after they took off and headed for the English Channel, the pilot knew she was a pilot. So they let her sit in the co-pilot seat, and she actually flew the B-17 over the English Channel. Now, she didn't take off with it, she didn't land it, but she got to fly it over the English Channel. So she had so many experiences. She had dinner with Vichy spies. I mean, just all kinds of things that she wasn't looking for. It's just these women, and again, it's not just my mother, but these women, especially when they were over on the continent, were able to get within a couple of miles of the front lines. They'd drive these trucks right up to the point where the men would come back for rest and recuperation. And that's where they'd serve them coffee and donuts and that kind of thing before they went back to the front line. And so they knew a lot about what was going on in the war. And they just had all kinds of experiences because of all the people they met. And you can imagine there weren't a lot of American women around. So they were stars everywhere they went. The men just went crazy to get a chance to at least talk with an American woman that came from their country, and they could talk about their home, they could talk about their sweethearts, they could talk about their wives, they could talk about music. Heck, my mother could even talk to them about baseball. So they loved them.
So let's jump back just a little bit. She spends time in England, and then at some point she's over on the continent, close to the front lines. When does that happen?
Yeah, she was over in England from about July of 44 to February of 1945. And then they sent her across the English Channel to, and again, I don't know if your viewers are going to be familiar with it, they called them the cigarette camps. They were replacement camps around the Le Havre area. And these camps, some of them held 30, 40,000 men. And as the men would land on the French coast, they would go to these replacement camps, and then they would be funneled into Germany and the front lines as replacements. So after the Battle of the Bulge, obviously, a lot of men lost their lives, and they needed replacements, and they'd funnel them through these replacement camps. They called them cigarette camps because each one was named after a cigarette brand, like Old Gold, and Chesterfield and whatever. And so she worked those for about 6 weeks, and she and her crew would drive into the cigarette camp in the morning, and thousands of men would line up for coffee and donuts, and they'd do that for hours. From there, she was sent to West Germany, and she was there for basically for about 2 months until the war ended, and then was sent to Bavaria after the war ended. But anyway, that's the timeline.
How does she wind up meeting these spies? And did she do any spying herself because of that?
No, no. She was in Paris on leave and decided to do some sightseeing, which anybody would do if they first time in Paris, and went to Versailles. And at the time, the French had provided guides that could speak English because there were so many American GIs, et cetera. And one of the guides that was assigned to her and some of the other Red Cross girls was a French girl. And she was very friendly, did a great job, did a lot of talking, and invited some of them over for dinner that night. And the Red Cross always encouraged the Red Cross girls to be friendly with the citizens of whatever country that they were in. And so they accepted. And but during the entire dinner, this girl and her parents constantly were pumping mom for information about where she was working and what units she was serving and where they were headed, et cetera, et cetera. And she became suspicious and reported it. And later on, she heard that they indeed were Vichy, which was the French government that was in cahoots with the Germans, that they were spies that were trying to get information to funnel to the Germans. She never heard what happened to them, but it was an experience.
Oh, I bet. And then you mentioned she was on one of Hitler's vehicles. How does that happen?
Well, not vehicles. And there's no evidence that he ever actually was on this ship.
Okay.
But he had ordered to be built 2 yachts that were ultimately going to be used to compete in the Olympics. And they were, I don't know the size, but they were fairly good sized yachts. Of course, back then, all made of mahogany. They're just beautiful, beautiful ships. And after the war was over, of course, they were confiscated. And there was a unit of the American Army that's their job just to go around and collect this kind of stuff. Cars, boats. Of course, the Monument Men, that movie, was about units that went and tried to collect art. Well, anyway, she became familiar with some of the officers that were part of that unit, and they invited her and some of the Red Cross girls to take a day cruise down the Rhine. And so she got to do that.
Did she ever talk about, I was so brave? Did she ever say anything along those lines? No. It sounds so incredibly brave to be near the front lines and when you could be contributing to the war effort back home. There's nobody who said she had to go overseas and join the effort.
No, she never said that. But I will say this on behalf, not just her, but all of those Red Cross women. And we call them Red Cross girls because that's what they were called at the time. That's what they called each other. Different time, different place. That was 80 years ago. But they were women in every sense of the word. They were older than most of the GIs, between 25 and 35. They were highly educated. They had to have a college education, which was very unusual for women at the time. Most of them had job experience. These were the cream of the crop. And every one of them wanted to do something for the war effort, but they didn't want to just be a secretary. I mean, obviously, when you have a good education and you've been working, et cetera, they're very independent. Most of them weren't married, and they wanted an experience. And they thought this was a wonderful way to get that and still contribute substantially to the war effort. And it was dangerous. And most of them became very aware of that the minute they got to England and went through a buzz bomb attack, for example. And I know of at least 11 of those women never came back. They were killed during the war. So, it was dangerous. But my mother would always say that what she did was nothing compared to what the men went through, and had nothing but the greatest respect for the American GI.
And as you warned me when we started talking to each other through email. This time was going to go fast. So here we are.
Yes.
Coming
I'm
up when
sorry.
I need to
I
start
talked too much.
bringing it home, and I'm fascinated, and I have like 10 more questions for you, but I think we gotta bring it in to stay in my time limit in terms of what happens post-war. If you can kind of go through the rest of her life, and you're born at some point post-war, right?
Well, there was a happy ending. The book starts out obviously, and her story starts out with a tragedy, with the death of her first husband. But in June, so this is right after the end of the war in Europe, in June 1945, and the Third Army 12th Corps happens to be stationed there, and she meets my father, who's part of Patton's Third Army. And they get married in 1946, live the rest of their lives in Kansas City. She becomes a church organist. She writes books on music history. She does all kinds of things. And they had a great marriage and 3 children. I happen to be the youngest, and I'm the one that, for whatever reason, got interested in history and family history.
Well, Robert, I greatly appreciate your time. The name of your book, because I haven't mentioned that, I'll let you mention your book here before we have to go.
It's called Forged in Fire, and of course that's the reference to the fact of what she had to go through during her 3 years of World War II.
All right, Robert, I greatly appreciate your time talking to us about a great Missourian who happens to be your mother.
Yes.
Which is really, really awesome. So I
Well,
appreciate.
thank you for having me and for your interest.
All right. Thanks for being on The Place for History.